Have you ever felt like what you do for God goes unnoticed? Like your quiet faithfulness is invisible, while others get all the praise? Ever wondered if it's worth continuing when no one seems to care? This is the story of someone who lived exactly that. He didn't seek fame, crowds, or titles. Yet he became one of the most essential, yet forgotten, figures in the rise of Christianity. His name was Timothy. And what he did in secret would help change the course of history. This isn't just a biography. It's a mirror for anyone who's chosen to keep going when everything around them says, give up. If you've ever felt unseen, this story is for you. Picture it, the quiet streets of Ephesus at night. A young man rushes through the shadows, his sandals slapping the stone paths. His cloak billows with the wind, hiding a fragile scroll inside. If he's caught, it could mean death. But he doesn't stop. Because what he carries in his hands could reshape the future of the Christian faith. He isn't looking for glory. He doesn't raise his voice. He walks without crowds or followers. But what he carries in his heart is powerful enough to shake centuries of tradition. His name is Timothy. And for too long, his story has been left in silence. You won't find his face in stained glass windows. No one's bear his name. Yet he was the spiritual heir of Paul of Tarsus, one of the greatest voices in early Christianity. But Timothy wasn't just a loyal student. He was a guardian of truths few dared speak. A young man tasked with preserving the purity of a faith that was still in its infancy, and already under attack. But who was Timothy, really? He wasn't born in Jerusalem. No golden temples. No famous schools. Just a small town called Lystra, forgotten by the empire, but not by God. His mother, Eunice, was a devout Jew, steadfast and full of faith. His father was Greek, likely indifferent to matters of the spirit. And that made Timothy a child caught between two worlds. To the strict Jews, he wasn't pure enough. To the Gentiles, he was too religious. He didn't fully belong to either side. Have you ever felt that? Like you're not quite enough for one group, and too much for another? And yet, it was in that very in-between space that his identity was born. From childhood, Eunice poured the Hebrew scriptures into his heart, not as a duty, but as an act of love. She spoke of Moses, of David, of the prophets, and those stories became the foundation of his soul. He didn't grow up with a temple, but he had a kitchen table. He didn't sit at the feet of a great rabbi, but he had a praying grandmother, Lois, whose whispered prayers shaped his destiny. And sometimes, that's enough. While other boys were learning to argue in the marketplace or build social influence, Timothy was learning to hear God in the silence. As a teenager, he was already known for his calm spirit, deep biblical knowledge, and ability to comfort others with just a few words. He wasn't chasing applause, but his quiet presence commanded respect. Sometimes, the Spirit doesn't need volume to be heard. Still, rejection followed him. Because he wasn't circumcised, many local Jews didn't see him as truly part of God's people. And that hurt, not out of pride, but because he loved God, and couldn't understand why his sincerity was questioned by those who claimed to know the law. Then, everything changed. A man arrived in Lystra. He had fierce eyes, a commanding voice, and scars that told stories. His name was Paul, the former persecutor turned preacher. His words burned with truth. He spoke of a risen Christ, of grace that breaks barriers, of a gospel for every culture. And while the crowd listened with curiosity, Timothy's soul caught fire. He didn't know it yet, But this was the beginning of a mission that would carry him far beyond anything he imagined. Paul saw in him what others missed. Not just a well-raised youth, but a willing heart, a spirit ready to endure hardship. Though still young, Timothy was invited to leave everything and follow. And he did. Before they left, Paul made a difficult decision. Knowing that Timothy's uncircumcised status could create unnecessary barriers, he asked him to undergo the ritual, not out of legalism, but for the sake of the mission. And Timothy, out of love for those he hadn't even met yet, accepted the pain. He would rather endure discomfort quietly than be a stumbling block to someone's faith. From that day on, his life was dust, journeys, and danger, but also community, miracles, and purpose. He traveled with Paul to Derbe, Iconium, Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth, not learning about ministry in theory, but living it daily. Always behind the scenes, yet holding everything together like a hidden pillar, unseen, but essential. Paul trusted him deeply. In one letter, he said, "I have no one else like him, who genuinely cares for your welfare." That's not just praise. It's a declaration of rare character in a noisy, superficial world. While others wanted pulpits, Timothy wanted to listen. And because he listened, he was given wisdom that could never be shouted, only lived. Today, many chase stages and titles. But Timothy chose a mission, a backpack, and the quiet voice of the Spirit. What would you do if God asked you to follow him without promise of fame or recognition? Because Timothy's story is only beginning. And soon, we'll see how this quiet young man played a key role in delivering the letters that would become the foundation of our faith. When Paul preached, Timothy listened closely. He studied the pauses, the rhythm, the weight of every word. But he also saw what came after, the arguments, the insults, the embraces, the tears. Sometimes, when everyone else had gone home, Timothy quietly cleaned his mentor's blood. Not out of pity, out of love. Because he understood, following Christ also means carrying the wounds of those who lead the way. In Philippi, he watched a wealthy woman named Lydia open her home to the gospel. In Thessalonica, he felt the wrath of the authorities. In Berea, they found eager hearts. In Athens, he heard Paul reason with philosophers. In Corinth, he witnessed a church rise among prostitutes, slaves, and merchants. Each city was a chapter. Each journey, a sacred lesson. But the real journey wasn't external, it was within. Timothy's once quiet heart now burned with purpose. He was beginning to understand the true weight of his calling. No longer just a student, he was becoming a witness. A servant. A shepherd. And still, he never chased the spotlight. In a world obsessed with platform and power, Timothy found joy in serving quietly. While others competed for titles, he sought souls. While some longed to teach, he longed to learn. Because he understood something rare, the kingdom doesn't need more loud voices, it needs more humble hearts. Maybe that's why Paul loved him so deeply. He called Timothy my true son in the faith. He gave him responsibilities he gave no one else. And it wasn't just affection, it was trust. Timothy was being shaped for something far greater than he could imagine. And what about you? Do you have someone you follow with that kind of loyalty? Or are you hoping to be followed without first learning to follow? Because often, the most influential people are the ones who never asked to be. What came next didn't just confirm Timothy as a disciple. It marked him as the keeper of a legacy that would outlive empires, a legacy written in ink, but sealed with tears. Timothy moved quickly from apprentice to steward of one of early Christianity's most delicate missions. With Paul often imprisoned and restricted, he trusted Timothy with his most precious treasure, his words. Timothy wasn't just sent to encourage churches, he carried letters. Letters that would become scripture. He carried more than parchment. He carried divine truths, words powerful enough to shake empires and tear spiritual chains. These weren't just notes. They were living theology, corrections, encouragements, revelations. And many of them passed through Timothy's hands. Imagine him. A young man walking dangerous roads, sacred documents hidden under his robes, knowing discovery could mean execution. And yet he went. Again and again. No applause. No recognition. Just faithfulness. But Timothy wasn't just a messenger. He was a bearer of the message. He didn't just deliver the letters, he embodied them. He knew their contents. He lived their truths. He wept over words penned by his spiritual father from a prison cell. What you and I read today in seconds, he protected with his life. Philippians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, Ephesians. They reached the churches because Timothy carried them with calloused hands and unwavering devotion. Sometimes he preached. Sometimes he remained silent. Sometimes he corrected. Sometimes he simply stood by. But he always showed up. He fulfilled his calling with a faithfulness so quiet that even heaven noticed. And here we see something deep. God doesn't need you to be popular to use you. He just needs you to be faithful. Timothy didn't have a commanding voice or flashy gifts. But he could be trusted. And that made him a cornerstone in God's eternal plan. What about you? What's been entrusted to you? A message no one hears yet? A ministry without a platform? A calling the world hasn't recognized? Don't dismiss what's inside you just because the outside hasn't caught up. Maybe your role isn't to be the face of the mission, but the heart that keeps it alive. As Timothy traveled in quiet obedience, new dangers were rising, this time, not from pagans, but from within the church itself. False teachers. Division. Deception. Now, Timothy would face something more painful than outside persecution, betrayal from inside the faith. Until then, Timothy had always been Paul's companion, by his side, learning, carrying, growing. But everything changed when Paul gave him one of his hardest assignments: stay in Ephesus, alone. Ephesus wasn't just another church. It was a melting pot of culture, intellect, and idolatry. The massive temple of Artemis dominated the skyline, and pagan influence seeped into every corner of life. But the greatest threat wasn't outside, it was inside. The Christian community was fracturing. False teachings, spiritual manipulation, confusion. And Paul's words were simple: stay. For most, that would have felt like exile. For Timothy, it was obedience. Not glamorous. Not exciting. Just the hard, gritty work of ministry. He had to confront elders, bring order, correct those abusing the word, and all while being seen as too young to lead. Paul knew the pressure he was under. That's why he wrote, "Let no one despise you because of your youth." He urged him to be an example, to lead with character, to preach with patience, to hold the line even when others doubted his qualifications. Timothy wasn't called to be liked. He was called to be faithful. He didn't ask for that role. He didn't climb for it. But when it came, he carried it with integrity. He faced criticism. He was dismissed. He wept, no doubt. But he didn't walk away. Because he knew leadership isn't about control, it's about service. And the cost of leading is often loneliness. While others fought for influence, he fought for integrity. He stayed loyal to Paul's teaching. He didn't dilute the truth for popularity. He didn't twist the gospel for gain. And when he didn't know what to do, he prayed. He waited. He trusted, not in himself, but in the Spirit who had called him. Have you ever felt like your age, your inexperience, or your obscurity is holding you back? Like you're giving everything, but no one notices? Then you're standing exactly where Timothy once stood. And that place is not a punishment. It's training ground. Faithfulness is forged in the fire of frustration. And it's there God separates those who want glory from those who want Him. Timothy was tested, and he passed. But the hardest test was yet to come. Because betrayal doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks like your own people. In time, Timothy realized the deepest wounds don't come from enemies. They come from friends who twist the truth. Within the church, subtle voices began to rise, sweet-sounding, spiritual-sounding, but toxic. The message of grace was being bent into control. Pride wore the costume of piety. People quoted Jesus, but lived for themselves. And Timothy stood right in the middle of it. Have you ever been there? Surrounded by people who claim they're for you, but quietly work against everything you believe in. Who smile in public, but tear you down in private. That was Timothy's life. Day after day, he stood firm, with gentleness, but without compromise. He corrected in love. He held the line. He wept quietly, but never gave up. Many tried to silence him. Others dismissed him for being too young. Some accused him of being too extreme. But Timothy wasn't chasing approval, he was pursuing faithfulness. And though he likely never said it out loud, night after night, he probably knelt and whispered, "Lord, am I doing the right thing? Is it still worth it, if no one sees?" The answer didn't always come through miracles. Sometimes, it came through a letter. A memory. A quiet voice in his soul that simply said, "Stay the course." Because a calling isn't measured by applause, it's measured by obedience when no one's watching. That young man, formed in the silence of Lystra, now stood in the storm of a divided church. But he didn't run. Because he had learned, truth doesn't always win popularity, but it changes lives. And while others shouted, he kept serving. While they argued, he kept sowing. Pressure shaped him. Opposition refined him. And fire tested him, not to burn him, but to prove him. Because sometimes, God lets you walk through fire, not to destroy you, but to reveal who you are. And maybe today you're in that same place, where leading is painful, serving is exhausting, and telling the truth makes you feel alone. If so, you're not lost. You're being forged. Just like Timothy. And just when things seemed at their lowest, a letter arrived. Paul's last. Written from a cold cell. With tears. With urgency. A spiritual will, not to a church, but to his son in the faith. Paul was in prison again, this time for the last time. Rome wasn't going to release him. And he knew it. His body carried the scars of 1,000 miles, his soul sensed the finish line. So he picked up his pen and wrote, to Timothy. These weren't instructions. They were final words. A father's last message to his son. The time of my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. This wasn't the bold Paul of old. This was a weary man in chains, at peace with the end. And all he asked was, "Come quickly." Imagine Timothy holding that letter in trembling hands, his mentor, his guide, the man who shaped his soul, asking not to be left alone at the end. Between the lines, a plea, not for rescue, but for presence. Paul warned him. More betrayals would come. Some had already abandoned him. He urged Timothy, stay faithful. Preach the word. Don't chase trends. Don't give up. And then, one final charge. Fulfill your ministry. Not for me. Not for them. But for God. For the gospel. For the call burning in your bones. That letter held dry tears and sacred fire. It was a legacy poured into Timothy's soul, line by line, name by name, burden by burden. And we've all had moments like that. A conversation. A letter. A sentence that never leaves us. That wasn't just ink on parchment. That was holy fire on a faithful heart. And as the world prepared to silence Paul, heaven was preparing to continue his mission through Timothy. But one final test remained. Because after Paul's death, Timothy would have to walk entirely alone. And that's when his true character was revealed. Paul's death wasn't just personal grief, it was a spiritual earthquake. The one who had shaped him, believed in him, covered him, was gone. And the mantle now rested on his shoulders. There were no spotlights. No applause. Only the weight of a calling, and the quiet courage to carry it forward. Timothy didn't try to replace Paul. He didn't need to. He just kept going. With a quieter voice. A gentler style. A steady heart. And a fire that never went out. He kept teaching. He kept correcting. He kept loving a church that didn't always love him back. Many wanted Paul's power. Few wanted Timothy's burden. We don't have many records of his later years. But what history does whisper is powerful. He never stopped serving. He never compromised. He never diluted the message to fit in. He remained faithful while others drifted. And that's what makes him great. Not miracles. Not fame. But faithfulness that endured the silence, the rejection, and the obscurity. A faith that didn't fade. A heart that didn't quit. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've lost mentors. Maybe your path feels lonely. Maybe your efforts feel invisible. Let me say this clearly. God doesn't need crowds to complete his work in you. He only needs your faithfulness. Timothy was forgotten by men, but never by heaven. His name may not be on monuments, but it's written in the eternal pages of Scripture. Not as a celebrity, but as a flame. A flame that never died. And there's one last truth, perhaps the most powerful of all. History doesn't record his death clearly. There are no annual tributes. No statues in his honor. But how could a man who walked with Paul, carried the sacred letters, strengthened churches, be so hidden in history? Maybe that was the point. Some early writings say that years later, in the same city where he once pastored, Ephesus, during a pagan festival for Artemis, Timothy stood once again. He lifted his voice, not in anger, but with conviction, and called the crowd to Christ. They beat him, dragged him, and killed him. There was no funeral, no worldly honor, but heaven thundered with applause, because the disciple had finished the race. He had kept the faith, not a faith of fame, but a faith that never sold out. And maybe that's why his story is so rarely told, because it confronts us. It exposes shallow leadership, fake devotion, applause-driven religion. Timothy reminds us, what is most true is often unseen. So let me ask, have you ever felt like your obedience doesn't matter? That your quiet faithfulness goes unnoticed? That your sacrifices disappear into silence? Then this story isn't just about Timothy, it's about you. Because God isn't looking for loud voices. He's looking for loyal hearts. He's not looking for performers. He's looking for carriers of the flame. He's not after fame. He's after faith. Timothy was not the most famous apostle, but he was one of the most faithful. And in the end, maybe that's all that truly matters.